Hi, I'm science illustrator and artist Mattias Lanas. In this episode, I'll be exploring painting trees with watercolors, drawing inspiration from artist explorer Tony Foster's journey, Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild. In 2014, Foster traveled to a very special mountain in the Himalayas in Nepal called Machapuchare, which translates as fish's tail in Nepali, so named due to the unusual double-forked shape of its peak. Machapuchare was nominated for Exploring Beauty by wilderness educators and avid adventurers Annie and Bill Vanderbilt, longtime travel companions and friends of Tony Foster. Interestingly, this mountain has never officially been summited because it's considered sacred by local ethnic groups, and so the government doesn't allow permits. Foster trekked around Machapuchare and introduced 4 large format paintings that capture the essence of the mountain and its environment. Besides the mountain itself, what really stands out to me in some of these works is the skill with which Foster has rendered the dense vegetation and local trees. In this piece, called Machapuchare 2, Modicola River Looking North, the trees are particularly apparent. I love the way Foster is able to show us individual trees as well as a sense of the entire forest cut through by the river. He uses a variety of greens to achieve this, and also works carefully to create leafy textures without overwhelming us with details. In this other piece, called Looking 70 Degrees East-Northeast to Machapuchare from a hill 400 feet above Tadapani, we get a stunning view of Machapuchare's iconic peak from a lush and tree-filled vantage point. A favorite artistic aspect of these trees for me, besides how unique and full of personality each seems, is how we get a sense of their volume based on the highlights and shadows in the trunks. Light on the left where the sun is shining on them, darker on the right where they're in shadow. This is also the case with the canopies, where masses of leaves have corresponding light and dark areas that help give the trees a 3-dimensional feel. In today's demonstration, I'm going to use some similar techniques to render a tree in watercolor based on a photograph. Of course, like so many subjects, there's incredible variety in types of trees. By no means will this demonstration be comprehensive. Each tree species has defining characteristics, and then there's individual tree personalities to consider based on how they've grown. Lighting also affects how a tree's colors are perceived. And then depending on the season, of course, there may be little to no green in the leaves at all. I've chosen to work from this photograph of mine because of its simple composition and because this tree will allow us to play with some of the techniques I was pointing out in Tony Foster's work. If you're following along with me today, and especially if you're new to painting trees, this simple exercise should provide you with a strong foundation to tackle others later. Do be sure to check out my materials video beforehand though, to know what supplies you'll need. Today's kit will be simple, including watercolor paper, a pencil and eraser, water, watercolor paints and brushes, and paper towel. Grab all of these, including a copy of the reference photo, and let's get started. For this particular tree exercise, I've decided to go loose, meaning I'm going to focus on overall shapes and trying to capture the essence of the form. I could spend hours and hours trying to get all of the minute details down on the page as I see them, but for time's sake and as a challenge to myself to stick to one particular type of watercolor style, I'm going to aim for something more loose this time around. As you can see, I've gone ahead and created my drawing for the tree, and I want for you to do the same. Keeping it very simple to general shapes, the overall form, a little bit of focus on the trunk. I mapped out my cast shadow at the bottom, and of course you're welcome to add in more details in the background as well, but I'm today just going to focus on the tree's form. One important element of this drawing that I'd like to point out is that I've mapped out several patches or clusters of branches or leaves. They look a bit like clouds, and for me this is useful because it helps me break up the entire tree's form into these distinct chunks. And take a look at the reference photo, see if you can see some of those chunks there. There's patches or clusters of leaves and branches that are coming closer to us, and then there's ones that are further in the background, and there's some that we can't see because they're covered up by the ones in the front. But this is really important when you're painting trees, is to try to break the form down, kind of like we do when we paint clouds. Break the form down into its component elements. And then if you paint those elements as they are, including adding volume to them, shadows and light areas, then you start getting a better sense of depth and of volume and 3D-ness for your tree, rather than just a blob of green that's very flat looking. So see if you can focus on patches like this and make sure you call them out, including drawing the spaces between those. So wherever you're seeing sky poking through in the background, it's good to have a couple of those in there. As with many watercolor subjects, we're going to paint this tree up in layers, starting with the lightest first and then building up gradually to darker and darker. And if we look back at Tony Foster's painting, you can see that he's done a similar thing with his trees, in certain ones especially. He begins with a yellow or a light green in the background, and then on top of that adds blobs, little dots of darker greens. So we get this overall effect of depth, and it's very rich and very alluring. So we're going to do something similar for ours. You can see that Tony Foster's particular style sticks out when you zoom into one of his pieces like this. It's almost this impressionistic style where he keeps all these little blobs of watercolor separate from one another. You don't get a lot of bleeding together. For mine today, I'm going to start with a bit more of a wash foundation and then likely build up a little less impressionistically, still with little blobs of color, but maybe not as separate as the ones that Tony has. We'll see what happens. So I'm going to begin by mixing up a yellow. We're going to go with Winsor Yellow. So this is the lighter of the yellows that I have in my palette. And mix up a good amount of that this time because this tree is kind of a large subject. I think I'm going to keep mine fairly diluted because I don't want this to be too overpowering, but feel free to experiment with it. You can try with a very strong yellow and then go from there and see what you get. I encourage you to do several tree paintings. These can go pretty quickly if you're loose with your technique. So let's see what that yellow looks like. So I'm using a flat brush here because I like the way that this brush kind of forces me to create a less uniform mark. It's these sideways marks. And for this part right here, it doesn't really matter because I'm kind of just filling in. But as I build up and become more detailed with each of these marks, I'd like them to be randomized as much as possible. I don't want too much order in my tree. I want it to give it this sense of chaos, like the leaves are in all kinds of different directions. We tend to be very regular as humans. We like things to be in order and very uniform. And so sometimes when painting nature, that aspect of our painting comes through a little too much and things start looking unnatural because they're too organized. So let's see if I can keep this as random and chaotic as possible for now. You can see I'm very loosely just filling this in with color and trying to avoid some areas intentionally to leave the sky behind, which for me in this case will be white. So while this is still wet, probably should have prepared ahead of time, but I'm going to do this on the fly. I'm going to grab some of my green, and this is Hooker's green, and just slide it right into this yellow pool that I had and mix some yellow in that as well so that we get more of a lime green, something that's closer to the yellow but definitely a green. We'll add some water to that, a little more pigment overall. We're creating a light, very yellow green. And again, while this is wet, if possible, I'll just start dropping a bit of this in areas where I see lots of shadow in these clusters. So especially at the bottom, and then right here it seems like I have a bunch of shadow, so I can go ahead and just start dropping some of that in. In some ways I'm just kind of mapping out my lights and darks, but it doesn't really matter. Ultimately we're moving more into this green direction, so if you end up covering up most of or all your yellow, that's okay. It is nice to have a little bit of your yellow peek through in the background, and it should do that naturally because you're layering the color over the yellow. But it's okay if some areas have more yellow, some less. So just start kind of filling in now with this green and letting the wet paper kind of diffuse those green edges in some places. As you can see, I'm being fairly loose about this, intentionally, just kind of going at it, filling this in. We're still working on our foundation layers, so this is not a problem to just kind of go for it and see what happens. And you know what? I ended up covering more of the tree than I had expected, and that's okay. I like this foundation layer. You know, some of Tony Foster's trees that we were seeing in his painting have a bit more of that yellow tone to them. This tree is fairly green, and so we don't need as much of the yellow poking through. So while this is setting up a little bit, I'm going to mix up a darker green. As I said, we're going to build this up in layers, And now we're going to continue focusing on the general light and dark areas. So again, I have a dark patch right here in the middle. I have some of these clusters of branches and leaves that are closer to me and that are being hit by sunlight, and then ones that are maybe further away, like this one back here that is a bit darker. There's a bit of dark right here as well. And so with this next color, I'm going to be a bit more methodical about putting those darker colors in where they go and leaving the lighter areas to be this light green color that we've created already. I'm also going to switch brushes to a small round brush for this next bit because I want to start being more detailed about where I place these dots. But first let me use my flat brush to mix up a color. So we'll continue in the same pool, take a bit more water, and I'm going to take the same Winsor green. Let's add a touch of Viridian to that, and maybe a hair of French Ultramarine as well. So we got a richer, darker green now. And one thing I like to do with my greens, especially greens in nature, is mute them down a little bit because the greens that are coming straight out of the tube tend to be very vivid and bright. And in nature, you don't see that many that are that bright. It's almost like they're neon greens. And so we want to just subdue those a little bit. And we do that by adding the colors complement. So I'm going to do a bit of Indian red. And it's just a touch of that. I may have already gotten too much. Let me wipe some off. I want to start conservative. This color will appear to not change my green too much on the surface, but it does just enough of a muting or of a subduing effect that this green now will be more realistic when we put it in. It'll be more true to the colors that we're seeing in nature. Like I said, I'm going to focus now on just creating some dark patches. And I also said I was going to switch brushes, so let's do that. Take this brush, test that out. Start to come in, and what I'm painting right now is called the negative space of an object. So if we're looking at this cluster of leaves right here, the space around it, the space that defines that shape, is what we call the negative space. And so by focusing on negative space shapes like this and putting darker values in there, I can help that positive space, meaning the shape itself, come forward a bit more and be more defined. Using my brush very loosely and doing a lot of these stipples, these little dots, and some of them I'm blending together with other ones, adding some more pigment. But again, I'm trying to create that feeling of chaos here, just lots of random marks, but focusing on areas that, you know, have darker marks in them. And as I get to the edge of some of these, this tree outline that I'd created, I might even fragment outside of those. So just add a bit more of these dots, give the illusion of leaves that are going a bit more beyond, especially in this area, but you don't need to do them all. Be careful in this stage with just filling the entire thing with dots, because if you do too much of that, it'll start looking flat. We're really looking to push and pull. So push the darks in, pull the lights out. So leave lots of light spaces where you see those. Be conservative with that. It'll be easier to always add darker colors later, but if it's harder to pull out lighter colors for watercolors especially. So I'm going to try to move a bit faster. Just stick in some of these where I see them. A little messy, a little loose, intentionally so. Playing with the form, kind of getting to know it a little bit. Okay, and now I'm feeling like I need to put my trunk in, so I'm going to grab another round brush. While this is drying and setting for now, let's mix up a brown. So we want this trunk here. It's a pretty dark color. We tend to go for brown right away. Really, if you stare at that color in this reference photo, it's more of a dark color. It might be slightly blue, it might be slightly, it's definitely in the black range, but it may not necessarily be brown. So don't create something that is too blatantly brown. We just want something dark. I might even start with French Ultramarine. It's just a very dark base of a color. So we'll create some of that. And I don't need a ton of this color because it's not very much that I'm doing, just the trunk and branches. But I may incorporate some of this color later into the tree, so I'll create an extra batch just in case. So mixing this up here, French Ultramarine. We'll add Blue's Complement, which is kind of an orangey color. So to do that, I'll mix up the two colors that make up orange, yellow, and red. So we'll take some cadmium yellow. It's already looking like a yucky green. This is a warm yellow, and we'll mix in a red, maybe some permanent rose, just a little bit at a time. You can see it's becoming kind of a yucky, browny, greeny color. Take some more French ultramarine. Let's see what that looks like. It's kind of a bluey gray right now, especially if I dilute that. Nice dark color. So we'll start with that. We're going to take a little bit, and we have generally light coming from the left, generally dark on the right. It's all very dark because it's cast in the shadow of the tree, but we still want to accentuate a bit of that value. So I'll start with the right side and then leave a bit right there. We'll do this other bit in a second. Do some of the branches, and you want to break these branches up because they're cutting through the canopy. So don't just create a straight line all the way up. Watch a little bit. You can even fragment this like this and give the illusion that we're seeing a bit poking through the leaves. I'm using my previous drawing a bit as a guideline, but also just looking at the reference and maybe creating some new marks based on what I'm seeing in there. I've got a thin one right here. Okay. Maybe this one here as well. Now take a bit of water on my brush, not too much. I'm not cleaning it off, but I'm just adding a bit to dilute. Oh, maybe that was too much. To dilute the pigment I have on here. That was too much water. Mop some of that up. We just want to get it moist. Moistening the rest of it, adding some color, and take some of our gray brown and just put that in there. Good for now. This is a first layer. You can see we've got that down as a foundation. And in the meantime, I'm going to mix up more of a true brown. We'll just use this little corner here. So that plus the blue. The brown is going to be more in the red spectrum of things. So it'll be a red type of brown. Using maybe this Indian red as a base, we'll add to that some raw umber. Maybe a touch of yellow ochre. And we have this bright color. We're not going to put this straight over, of course, but we can take a little bit of the blue that we mixed and add that to just mute this really bright color that we created. Better. And now, let's see, it's mostly dry down here. I can just layer this, do a glazing, and we'll get the darkness of the color that we put down underneath this, plus the brilliance of this brown working together to create a very muted brown, which is exactly what we want. Let's go back to our tree's canopy now. So I'm going to stick with this larger brush right now, just clean it off, and we'll take more of our green, the same green that we mixed up. Just re-wet this if it's dried up. In fact, I don't have very much on here, so I'm just going to remix some of this. And it can be an approximation, it's okay. So we'll take, again, this Hooker's green, add a touch of Viridian, a little French ultramarine, and then mute this down. Let's use some Indian red for that. A little more water so it flows really well. Okay. That's good. It's darker. That's okay. And now we're just going to do another layer of application, specifically trying to once again build up the darks. So we're going to go into the darks to let the lights pop out a bit more. So right back to where I was before in these negative spaces. And now I'm being a bit more careful where I'm placing these little blobs of color, not just everywhere, because this is a darker dark. You can see that the magic that happens when you start layering these greens, you start creating this sense of volume in your tree. And move the angle of your brush around as you work. Don't just always approach your dots from the same angle, because you'll start to create too much of a regular mark. If you move your brush around and place it down from different angles like this, you'll create different varied marks that'll make a more realistic outcome. Okay, I'm going to go bold now and create some more negative space marks. And even take a little more water, break some of these blobs up a bit more, and even start covering new areas with a lighter shade of this color just to break it up a bit more. Adding water to this, using that diluted version to add more soft tones to some parts of these yellows, or rather it's really a lighter green, not a yellow. And I'm painting in right now some of these tips that are sticking out of the tree. It helps if you stop and squint at your piece every once in a while. Squinting will help you break up areas of darks and lights, and so you'll see which general areas are the darkest and which general areas are the lightest. Right now, and I'm seeing in mine, these are the lighter areas right here, and then the darker shapes are like right there, maybe there. And then I can look at my reference photo as well and compare, make sure that those are lining up with what I'm seeing in the reference photo for darks and lights. And if not, then I just need to do a bit more work to emulate that. Okay, I'm getting close to where I want to be with this part, and then we're going to mix up another color, another green variation. So for this next layer, I want to go even darker and get closer to maybe what's going on with this brown here. You can see that where the trunk enters the canopy here, enters the leaves, in the reference photo we lose a bit of a sense of where all those trunks are going. That's partly because the trunk is obscured by leaves, but it's also because this part of the tree in the reference photo is pretty dark, and so that darkness of this area is approaching the darkness of the trunk itself. Especially if you squint your eyes and look at this section right here, you'll see that it looks just kind of fuzzy, muddy. You can't really tell where the trunks are going up after they insert into the leaves. So we know that this next dark that we create, we should make it fairly dark, and then just be a bit more sparing in where we place it. We'll use the same foundation here. I'm going to take some of my trunk color, since I have that, and start to drop it in here. So that'll be my foundation. And then I'm going to take the same foundation I've been using for the leaves, this Hooker's green, mix that in. Really, you can do that in either of these sections. I think I'm going to add some more brown to this as well. Since I have this one here, I'll just take some of that. I love just reusing the colors that I already have mixed up on my palette. Okay, great. We've got a very dark, very subdued green. Let's see what that looks like as a test. Actually, that could be darker, I think. So I'm going to take more French Ultramarine, which is kind of my go-to darkening agent. Maybe some Viridian. This is already a dark green, and so we can use that. That looks good. So we'll take this now, and a bit more sparingly than with this last green or greens, just start to drop that in where we see extreme darks, using the same technique of careful blob dropping. You can see how a little goes a long way with this, especially with these, once you start getting to these darks. And you can think about putting some darks in that are representing the leaves that are all the way on the other side of this tree. So they're just a little bit poking through in the gaps between the leaves that are closest to us. So that might mean just, dropping one or two little dots here and there occasionally. So once again, I'm squinting as I'm doing this bit here because I want to focus on the darks, the extreme darks. And I'm also kind of continuing to define these clusters, these shapes that I've created. And even if they no longer fully match what you were seeing in the reference photo, it's okay. use that as a guideline for yourself, and then continue to build up those clusters in your piece as you see them now. Remember to keep rotating the angle at which you're placing these blobs of color so that they don't become too uniform. You want them to be a bit more random in nature. And keep stopping to squint at your piece. It's essential that you do this. You sort of tilt your head back, look at it from afar, get a sense of how those darks and lights are going. All right, that's looking pretty good. I think I'm going to go one layer darker. So you can do as many of these as you like, really. You can build them up very gradually. But we've done a bunch already, and I feel like just maybe do one more, and then I could call it for this piece. I just see some kind of extreme darks that are, again, approaching the color of the trunk, but I think we could go a bit darker just for a couple of areas. So greens, I got my Viridian and my Hooker's green. I'm going to add to that French Ultramarine, my darkening agent. And you know what? That might be okay. It's a bluey green, very dark. But let's try that out. Didn't add any brown to it, but that might be okay. And just selectively dropping this in a couple of areas. That might be enough. May have gone a bit overboard. It's hard to tell because of the reflection I'm seeing, but I may have gone a little overboard right here. And while this is wet, I could take a damp brush and just do a slight mop up in one or two places to give us the indication that there are light leaves in front right here. That helps again create a sense of depth if we have some lighter leaves poking through in the foreground. So now we're going to do the shadow. It can be hard to gauge the actual color of a shadow, but you want to definitely avoid the temptation of going straight into your tube of black color and making a gray from that and putting that down. It'll look very artificial if you don't have some colors from the subject itself or its surrounding incorporated into that. So I think I'm going to go with a bit of a blue this time, or maybe we can use this gray, blue, green that we'd mixed up previously, because I see some of that in the reference photo. And let's see what that would look like. It's actually looking pretty good. So we'll take that and add a bit more water to it so that it runs really well. That will also dilute it. And then I'm just going to place this in, making sure that the trunk is dry, which it is, and create a simple wash. I don't want the shadow to be a detractant from the tree. I don't want it to call too much attention to itself, but a light shadow will add the effect of 3D-ness, or help to convey that effect of 3D-ness. And I can break up the edge a little bit using the edge of this brush before this dries. And then again before this dries, maybe take a little more of this French Ultramarine. I'm gonna darken this area closest to the tree. All right, and I think we'll leave it there. So simple exercise. Of course, I could spend a lot more time on this and really refine it, create my illusion of grass in there. Probably if I were to spend more time on this subject, I would add more browns into the tree itself. So when I'm mixing up my greens, I would have added some more browns to those mixtures, because overall this tree appears a little too green, too neon vibrant green to be real. And again, if you're creating a tree like this in a composition in landscape with other elements, you'll have to gauge that color against the colors in the other elements to figure out what the best greens are. But as I'm seeing this right now, it's a little too vibrant for me, but it fits the point of the exercise, and hopefully that was useful.
There you have it, an exercise covering the basics of rendering 3D trees and paying special attention to general forms. Trees can seem like simple subjects at first, but it's easy to become overwhelmed by all of their detail.
As with most subjects, it's important to remember to draw and paint what you see and not what you assume or what you think you're seeing in order to truly capture the character and individuality of your trees. This will be especially true when you go out into the field to paint your own from life. Still, thinking in terms of general shapes and lights and darks will help you build a scaffolding for a successful piece no matter what your subject is. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You can access the other videos in this series on YouTube and also on the Foster website at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for joining me.